Welcome back to Absolute Units, the official podcast of the Museum of English Rural Life. I'm Joe Vaughan, the museum's social media manager, and I'm joined by Dr. Ollie Douglas, our curator of collections. Often we talk about nature as if it's something separate to us, a different system, a resource for us to use and, in many cases, exploit. Where did that view of nature come from? What are its issues, and how do we challenge it to better centre nature in our thoughts and our actions? Joining us this episode are two of our colleagues from the University of Reading, Tom Oliver, Professor of Applied Ecology, and Marzia, lawyer and lecturer. We talk about their project named the Nature-centric Catalyst, exploring how we can rebuild and reimagine our links to the natural world and all life on planet Earth. Enjoy. Welcome, Tom and Marzia, to Absolute Units. It's very nice to have you with us.
Thank you. Hello.
Thanks, Joe. Thanks, Ollie. Thanks for having us.
A long time in the planning.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So I think it's a good place to start to think about radical rural, because in the last podcast we were talking back and running back over radical rural, and you guys featured, or your project featured briefly in radical rural. And I think the reason for that was that I came to one of your project events and Anna Dillon, the artist, was there. So we incorporated some of her work, and that was a jumping off point to talk about your project. But I wonder whether we could start by introducing both the project and what your specialisms are. How do you connect to a Museum of English Rural Life, and why is your work relevant here?
So myself, I work here at the University of Reading, Professor of Applied Ecology. I guess I used to do a lot more landscape ecology. So it's the effects of farming and climate change affecting wildlife, so birds, butterfly populations. But actually, I guess in the last maybe 10 years or so, I've been doing a bit more interdisciplinary work about how our relationship to nature is very important in terms of how we protect wildlife. So I guess it's bringing in those different disciplines of environmental psychology, or the kind of vaguely termed systems thinking type approaches. I also work as the research dean for our environment theme in the university.
That's a snappier way of saying your enormously cumbersome other job title, which I think is Associate Pro Vice Chancellor for Research in the Environment.
Yeah,
is that right?
Brackets environment.
Yes, research team. Snappy.
Amazing.
Yeah, and Marzia.
So I am a lecturer in law at the University of Reading, and I am also a foreign qualified solicitor and a attorney in South Africa. You can tell by my accent I'm South African. And I have been involved in sort of risk projects, risk management, had a career in risk management, but then went through a phase of, I guess, personal discovery. And I think being South African, you sort of grow up really connected to nature. And I found myself in England and sort of trying to rediscover how to connect to nature in the UK, and, understanding what the environmental situation in this country is. And so my work has then moved from risk into understanding risks for nature. So that's what brought me to this project.
Yeah, so I guess we're all colleagues in a way. We're all part of the University of Reading. It's a big institution, and I think a really nice way to introduce your project would be to think about how considerations of nature within big institutions are part of what you both do, both in terms of legal frameworks and also in terms of influencing and connecting to policy, or ways in which we can sort of incorporate nature into governance. Could you sort of pick up on that and give us a sense of where your starting point for the project research was?
Yeah, sure. So, the university is really well placed to work on sustainability. And we've always had strengths in climate science, weather science, also in ecology, etc. So strength in environmental science. But if we actually want to think about solutions to the climate and nature crisis, you really do need to bring in the social sciences, the humanities, because at the root cause of, it's a people problem essentially that we face. So it's about people, and it's about how we relate to each other, and it's about how we relate to nature.
So we actually had a very similar chat about that in the last episode, where we were saying about one of the strengths of the whole like Radical Rural project has been bringing in so many kind of diverse voices and different people and, you know, different backgrounds into like to the Merle. So it's
absolutely. Yeah.
That's what I'm thinking.
I think it really does require that knitting together of the different disciplinary approaches. And universities traditionally, I guess, have kept those very siloed. And I mean, even now we have in the University of Reading research divisions, which are by traditional, you know, disciplines. So a part of the thinking behind the project is to really focus on that sense of who we are in relation to each other and nature, and bring that into how we think about protecting the environment.
But I think the starting point is really the sense that we are separate from nature and that there's this domination over nature. And if you own something that is like a natural entity, you have control over it and you can decide what to do with it, whether, you know, it should be transformed into crops or whether you want to pull out some trees because, you know, you want to build something. So it's just that sense that we control it as humans. And that's the human-centric way of thinking. And the project is really trying to shift that into a nature-centric way of thinking. And we have trialed through the project the various ways of how you can shift that thinking. And those governance structures that have been created and have been in existence for hundreds of years, not millions of years, just want to say only hundreds of years, we can change that into a different form of governance, a nature-centric form of governance.
On that idea of humans dominating nature, when did that emerge? Actually, that's a massive question, but...
Well, as Marzia said, it's actually something that's relatively recent. So humans have been around, modern humans, since 300,000 or so years. And actually, it's only in the last few hundred years that we've really changed that model of thinking. So if you imagine, let's say, a row of chairs, 1,000 chairs wide, and each of those chairs represents 300 years, then of those 1,000 chairs, it's only in the last chair, really, that the Enlightenment period would have occurred. And in the Enlightenment period, there was a real shift. So philosophers like René Descartes really focused on how humans were divine. Our minds are divine, but our bodies are just mechanical clockwork things. And actually animals too, he thought, were just clockwork beings, which actually set the scene for incredible cruelty to animals, just treating them as these kind of feelingless machines, essentially. But I mean, you may say, okay, it was slightly before that, even before the Enlightenment, even though this sense of sort of disconnection and human exceptionalism kind of accelerated then. The ancient Greeks, Aristotle, for example, talked about the ladder of all beings, and humans were at the top, like a kind of pyramid. And at the bottom, you've got your kind of animals and then your plants. And so this scale of beings. And, but even that was just a few chairs along. And actually, if you look at the other 990 chairs, we would have been thinking very, very differently. Humans would have evolved much more, seeing ourselves as not separate from nature. And many, cultures today around the world still retain that sense that nature is an ancestor, it's part of us. So this way of thinking of being separate from nature is actually a really weird, odd thing that's happened in our modern Western culture.
And I also want to add that this idea of ownership versus custodianship is also interesting, because John Locke, who brought us intellectual property, he said, if you mix your skill, labor, and judgment with an item of nature, then you own it. So, whether it's cutting a tree down, making a chair, but also if you toil the land. So this idea of ownership is also very central to this more recent thinking, whereas in some cultures, indigenous cultures, for example, it's only custodianship, and it's nature will continue to exist and we come and go. So we are just custodians for a short period of time. And I think that's really important in the mind shift.
I think we've spoken about Locke briefly on the podcast before, either with George Monbiot or with Guy Shrubsole, or possibly both, because Locke's ideas are bound up in that sense of ownership of land as well, that if you mix your own behaviors and practices with the land, and agriculture and resource extraction are ways in which you do that allows you to lay claim to the land in that modern kind of market capitalist way. So those ideas are sort of running hand in hand with enclosure and lots of the sort of complex land access questions that we talked about in the past. What I think is really interesting about this is that essentially these Enlightenment ideas emerge in parallel with a lot of the colonial project. And some rethinking of that period of history has taken place quite recently. So I would point you towards the work of David Graeber and David Wengrow in The Dawn of Everything, where essentially they draw on some of these indigenous influences on the Enlightenment. So there's a really kind of complex intermingling of ideas where indigenous practice and knowledge is incorporated into a process that then acts back and sort of extracts and separates out humans from nature. Another really interesting example, which directly confirms what Marzia is saying, is the work of Bruce Pascoe in Bruce Pascoe's Dark Emu, and it's about the colonial encounter between European settlers and Australian Aboriginals, and Aboriginal cultures being essentially sort of extractive of the land in various different, slightly more sympathetic ways, but the fact that they're not digging up the land in agricultural ways that Europeans would recognize becomes the justification for then taking over that land and taking it away from native communities and First Nations peoples. So I think there's a kind of really complex mess going on there, and we've got to unpick that. Is that right?
Absolutely. It's interesting that you link anthropocentrism to also the colonial attitudes. And I actually worked with a Finnish researcher on a study where they extended that to also link to patriarchy versus sort of more feminist approaches. Because actually you have philosophers like Francis Bacon who talk about, subduing nature and bending her to our will. And it's a very loaded way of talking about nature that's very control oriented. And I think actually there's that kind of unlearning in many ways of those less favorable parts of our history that we need to do to recalibrate our relationships with nature, I think.
I feel like so many of these ideas are they're so ingrained in society, the idea of how humans' separation, but also control over nature. Like, I guess we're so immersed in it that it's strange to imagine something else. And yet, like you say, for so much of history, that something else was the norm.
And we're sitting in the Museum of English Oral Life, which is essentially building on exactly that same division. This is a collection that's about culture, not nature. It's about human action and extraction from nature, but not actually the natural world and the sort of agencies of natural process. Sort of runs hand in hand with those, but it's definitely on the human side, not the nature side.
Yeah, I hear that, but I also think that what this museum gives me personally is a reminder that there are ways of living in harmony with nature when you're involved in agriculture, because I think modern techniques are way more extractivist. I don't know if it's because maybe a lot of the implements are made of wood or metal and not high-tech stuff. I don't know, it just feels more natural and more in harmony. And so, yes, maybe it's a reminder of that. But I do think it was also at a time where there was more access, back to that point on access to land before enclosure. There were more communities involved in growing their own food. And this idea that this is new, it's not new. It's actually a way of governing that's more natural and that communities are doing today. And so some people might say, oh, well, there's a way of seeing what Indigenous communities are doing and trying to adopt it in the West. No, first of all, we're inspired by it, yes, and we should be inspired by the way these communities can still live in harmony with nature. But also, it then reminds us that not long ago, we were living in harmony with nature. And I think these are important things to remember when we're looking at this nature-centric governance approaches, which I'm sure we'll get to.
I just had one quick point on the significance of our collection, because I definitely agree with you and I see what you mean. I think it's really interesting when you move from seeing farming equipment today, which is all, I guess mass manufactured in large factories, versus these kind of much more carefully, individually crafted implements that we have in our collection. And in a way, I suppose what we have here is a view or a depiction of agriculture and agricultural practice before mechanization, before it went to that next degree of intensity and the scale. And Ollie, you've talked before about the sort of destructiveness of modern farming. And I guess mechanization presents a kind of intensification of that process. Do you agree?
I think it does, but I think these things come full circle. So if we take, for example, farm technologies that are adapted to place, and plows are a good example of that, but many other farm tools are built in place for particular landscapes and ways of farming particular environments. We've kind of reached that point again in regenerative farming, where we're using precision farming, which is using other tools, sort of fourth generation tools and technologies to adapt technologies in farming to particular and very fine-grained elements of the landscape in place. And we talked a little bit about that with Alice Mauchline in one of our first episodes. I think that the difference there is that perhaps those technologies aren't built in the places. They're designed elsewhere. So the sympathy with place is somewhat lost from that process. I don't know, does that resonate with you, Tom, in relation to some of your experience of working in ecologies of agriculture?
I think so. I mean, I think it's also not just where the machines are made, but also the people who are operating them. You know, if you've got tenant farmers that are employed by someone else who's maybe living in a different country, that person who's directing the activities has less connection to that land. They're not even, necessarily visiting it. Whereas obviously the small is beautiful idea, when communities or economies are small, then people are more aware of the impacts of their activities. And I think keeping that link is important so that you can see the impact of your activities and others around you can see the impact of your activities. In the modern world, we've amazing technology, we've scaled up, we can speak to each other on the other side of the world, etc. But at the same time, we've created very complex chains where our impacts can ripple across the planet. And unless we have, really good systems thinking capacity where we start to see, okay, if I buy something here, it impacts something elsewhere, or if the way I tell my tenant farmer to farm is going to impact, local communities, etc., or the fish in the river. Unless we see those links, then we lose that ability to manage the land sustainably, I guess.
On your point about people directing farmers in other countries, we've actually been talking on Blue Sky this morning about the Tanganyika groundnut scheme. Ollie, would you give a quick description of that for listeners? Because it seems pertinent. Yeah,
so in the aftermath of the Second World War, there were major food shortages in Europe and challenges around food security, which emerged partly from that sort of wartime period, but they're exacerbated post-war. If you imagine we're still in the middle of rationing, and the British government come up with a range of different schemes that are essentially about agricultural extension overseas and exploiting other landscapes and extracting resource from there in sort of big cash crop economy ways. One of those, and perhaps the most famous and in some ways the most disastrous, is the Tanganyikan groundnut scheme, where they took vast swathes of Tanganyika, now Tanzania, and tried to cultivate ground that had not really been cultivated in major technologically, agriculturally advanced ways in the past, entirely to grow peanuts, groundnuts, for the production of oil to meet cooking oil shortages across Europe and in particular the UK. It was a massive failure, partly because they just decided in a sort of government think tank way that this is going to work. We'll invest vast amounts of money in this. We'll throw machinery at the problem, and we'll just do it
with very little systems thinking.
Yeah,
with the domination over nature mindset.
Yeah, and a domination over local communities, local expertise in terms of landscapes, all of that knowledge just sort of overwritten by big machines and lacking in infrastructure to deal with those machines. Lots of machinery companies were involved, big multinational corporations were involved, and were going to benefit from the production end of things. But essentially, it all crashes and burns, and it crashes and burns because they've just leapt forward far too fast into something that is just never going to work. If they'd gone softly and sort of tried little bits of development and tried out a few ideas, then it might well have worked. And actually, the scientific advisors involved were keen to do that. The chief scientific advisor on the project was a man called Hugh Bunting, who later came to the University of Reading and set up courses in tropical agriculture. He was a botanist and an agricultural botanist, and he's really well respected. But that's a kind of blot on his copybook that he was connected to this really disastrous government-funded scheme. Hugh Bunting was a big critic of it, even though he was involved in it. So there's a kind of interesting thing there. Not listening to scientists is a disastrous thing. Sometimes listening to them can be disastrous as well, but, tensions.
Yeah. I mean, it'd be lovely to say that we've learned lessons as a society, but, we still, in the UK, as an example, we import more than 90% of our fruits and 46% of our veg. And actually much of those products come from African countries where we've, I say we, but Western countries are pushing a model of industrial agriculture, and that is very reliant on, for example, irrigation systems, etc. And that's not going to last forever with the climate crisis worsening across the equatorial belt. And then when that agriculture begins to fail, I mean, the question is whether the small scale community farming that would have been there before is still there and resilient. And I guess it's a good example of that colonial anthropocentric mindset that is so damaging.
But also, I think this is where this paradigm shift needs to happen in the Western way of knowing. And I think that local knowledge and local wisdom is really important. That knowledge of it's going to rain this year because I know that tree only flowers, if we're going to have lots of rain this year, or there's so much knowledge, and that's where this nature-centric approaches comes in. Because if we look at the approaches we looked at in our project, one is rights of nature. So this is where nature has got inherent, intrinsic rights. Not we don't value nature, we don't value a tree because of its utilitarian value, and by giving it rights, hopefully it can start to take action if one of the rights are infringed upon. For example, this is done in the UK, all over the country, forests, rivers, where you have a charter saying that, for example, this river has the right to have a flourishing biodiversity, it has the right to flow, it has the right to be clean, all of these rights. And then if those rights are infringed upon, there is a hope that you'd be able to take action. And then the second approach is nature representation. And this one is where, as a human, you, by proxy, start to represent nature's interests in decision-making. And this is an extension of participatory democracies, but just extending it to the more than human or to natural entities. And, with your example there, you would almost say, okay, well, what type of nature would have to have been represented in that decision-making process? And would that have shifted the thinking of how the project would have run and how they would have done things? And would they have included the wisdom and knowledge of the local people who could represent and speak for the nature that's there? And then the third way is nature as a stakeholder in corporate governance. So this is where you can have nature on the board. Most people know about nature on the board.
Could you explain nature on the board?
Yes. So nature on the board is when on a board, somebody is a nature representative and has got certain rights in board meetings to speak for nature and to vote when there's decisions being made on, I guess, business strategies. There are certain votes that nature can have for or against those. You can also have nature as a trustee, which is what the Scottish Marine Society has done. So they've had ocean is a trustee. And then there is a human, obviously proxy, who has to represent that voice in board meetings. And, there's been a lot of discussion about nature representations. And maybe Tom can come in and sort of say how that's done authentically and effectively.
Perhaps before you jump in, Tom, I want to try and contextualize this in relation to both some rural practices that might be familiar to some of our listeners, but also then in relation to the museum. We are not currently, I think, giving a voice to nature. We haven't got nature on the board. So these are things that I think we could be considering as well. But just to get a sense of what Marzia was saying, if we think about, say, for example, peatland and we think about forestry, both of those in that human dominion over nature context would be resources that we extract from. We cut the peat, we use it for burning or for our gardens. And with forestry, we cut down the trees and we burn them, and we perhaps extract value from those spaces in other ways in terms of leisure and sort of using those spaces recreationally. If we think about putting a value on nature, and there are ways in which carbon credits and other sort of forms of government practice and policy are doing that as part of a kind of climate mitigation or an environmental strategy at the moment. I guess with both of those, you might fund projects that are about peatland restoration or fund reforestation projects. And in doing so, you're placing something of a sort of market capitalist value on them. A bumblebee has just flown into the room as well.
There's also a car alarm outside.
Yeah, so that we're in an urban centre enjoying little snippets of nature coming into the room.
On the board.
Did you see
the bumblebee's enjoying this?
Did you see that bee? What was it called? What is it called when bees get together? It's a hiving. Is it called a hiving?
Swarming.
Swarming in the middle of Reading town centre. Did anyone ever see that? Just across the way where the ale house is.
Right.
There's a bollard.
Okay.
And there was a bee swarming.
I think it's possibly from Risk, the organisation that's based over that direction. I think they have beehives on the roof there. So urban beekeeping, bit of nature in urban centres as well.
There's that moment of awe. You know, you're going to come
on the next episode. I think
we'll come on to awe. So those are sort of some examples of that shift. And I guess this nature-centric approach would be more to accept the inherent rights of peat to exist as a form of natural carbon capture, space and landscape, not to necessarily place a financial value on it. And likewise, woodland and forest and value it for its intrinsic natural value and properties. In relation to the museum as an institution, I want to sort of turn that question of good examples to you, Tom, in the context of the Museum of English Rural Life. We don't currently have a curator who's giving voice to nature. I mean, I guess Joe and I and other colleagues are trying our best to do that through our practice and through thinking about nature, but I don't think we necessarily do it in quite that way that's spoken about in terms of giving voice to nature. We don't have nature on the board, either on our sort of collections governance committee within the context of the university or within the Merrill Advisory Committee, which is a set of advisory voices from both around the university and beyond. So I don't think we're really doing any of those things yet. And if there are good examples out there, we would love to learn from those and maybe think about how we might begin to make those steps towards incorporating nature and nature's voice. So yeah, coming back to Marzia's question, can you give us great examples of where this is working, where nature governance and nature-centric ways of thinking are already in practice?
I mean, there are a number of organisations which are sort of pushing the frontiers of trying this out. I mean, there's the clothing company Patagonia has nature as a shareholder, is that right? Or trustee, nature as a trustee. Or there's Faith in Nature, the cosmetics company that have nature on the board, as Marzia mentioned, able to veto decisions if, for example, something is being discussed, a new way of a new supply chain choice that actually could negatively impact nature. Then there's an option to step up and have that reconsidered. So I think, to come back to Marzia's point, how can this be done well? It's obviously challenging to represent, 10 million species. We think there may be 10 million on the planet, but we're not sure. About 85% haven't even been named yet. So, the challenges of representing this amazing web of life is hugely challenging. But if we don't take a step to have that voice on par with our one human species, evidence shows that we trample upon those species in terms of their ability to thrive. So it's important to do that. There are ways that we can think about doing that in a way which maintains integrity and doesn't end up in sort of greenwashing, because as these approaches spread, maybe companies say, oh, this looks good. If I have nature on a board, maybe I can sell more products because I'm sustainable. And many consumers are now more, mindful of buying sustainable products. So before you know it, you could have fossil fuel companies saying they've got nature on the board, but it's actually the photocopy boy who's just told to keep quiet. So there's ways that we can think about making sure that the integrity of these approaches is maintained, which is, the devil's in the detail. And that's the type of thing we discuss in some of the project meetings, and we keep talking about this nebulous project. It's called the Catalyst for Nature-centric Awareness and Governance. And the governance side is all about these mechanisms by which this fundamental pivot in our worldview, seeing ourselves that we are nature, what does it mean if we change the way our economic systems work, our legal systems, how they actually work fundamentally?
Yeah, this would be a really good moment, I think, to talk about what the project actually involves. Like what, in terms of moving towards those nature-centric systems of governance and worldview, I suppose, like what kind of things would you implement?
Yeah. So I can say that, if you think about how we've thought about species conservation, in about 80s and 90s, I don't know if you remember the kind of WWF, Save the Tiger, Save the Whale campaigns. So they were based on the intrinsic value of those species. The tiger's wonderful, let's save it. And also the fact that the whale or the panda or the tiger are umbrella species. If we can protect those, we protect all the little tiny moths and frogs that we don't even know exist at the moment. But it was based on the value of those species. It didn't work enough. And so in probably around the 2000s, we had this, what was called the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment. And it took a very utilitarian way of looking at nature, saying, okay, well, nature provides things that benefit humans. Let's call them services. Let's call them ecosystem services, the services that an ecosystem provides. Things like purifying our water, cleaning our air, providing pollination that means we can eat our crops, decomposing waste so that we're not up to our knees in leaf litter, etc. So, yeah, nature does these things for us. The idea is if we can kind of quantify them and value them, we can take that value, maybe a monetary value even, mesh it into the way our economy works. We don't need to change who we are, but we just essentially, our economy and the market economy will do things different. Now, there is some merit in this approach. If you recognize the value of nature, you're not kind of ignoring it. You're not treating it as zero value, but it can backfire in certain ways. So one is that there's an example of a trade port in South Africa that was going to be built. It was going to provide jobs for the local economy, transport, etc. But there was lots of important biodiversity, nature in the area. And they monetized the value of the different services that nature provides, but also versus the livelihood benefits of this trade port, etc. And so the organization that did this, which was called TEEB, the Economics of Ecosystems and Biodiversity, used this as an example of how you can, represent the value of nature. But when you ask them what happened, they say, oh, yeah, actually, they decided the trade port was more valuable, so they destroyed the biodiversity. And they built this big port. And I guess that's the problem. There's always a reason to build a trade port, or maybe it's something good like, a factory for desalinating water. So you've got drinking water. It's hard to argue with that. So you've got drinkable water. But, so as the need gets more, biodiversity always loses out. And that's the problem with providing a monetary value for something which arguably is life. And life has, I wouldn't put a monetary value on my daughter or my son or even my pet. So it's a very different way of thinking about the world, whether we put a finite value on something that actually many of us would, if we deeply thought about it, would think is of infinite value.
There's also a kind of strange irony, I suppose, where you're trying to justify the value of animals through their service to humans. It remains very human-centric in that way, even though it's trying to extol the virtues of pollinators or these different species. It's looking at through that prism.
It's completely human-centric.
What does it do for humans? Yeah,
it's completely human-centric, and it treats them as an asset. So a lot of these documents now, we had in the UK a big assessment of the economics of biodiversity, Sir Partha Dasgupta, and it talks about treating nature as an asset, as a form of capital, a form of natural capital to go along with our social and our financial capital. And although there is a part deep down in that report which talks about the intrinsic values of nature, it's very much kind of not the main part of the focus, which is about giving a monetary value. And when we treat nature as an asset, what we actually do is psychologically distance ourselves from it. So it's easier to treat it, like other things that we can just think we can pick it up and move it elsewhere. But actually, I don't treat again, thinking back to my family or my pets, I don't treat them as an asset. I care about them, not because of what they give to me. I care about them because I see them as part of my identity. And extending that sense of care to other species is a fundamentally different way of seeing nature, which underpins this nature-centric governance.
Yeah, well, I was going to say it's that we don't value the tree as it grows and as tall as it is and as many years as it is. We value it thinking about, what type of furniture it will give us. That's the value that it has. It's not the value of the tree as it stands and grows. And I think that's the difference in valuing. But I think the reason we don't monetize or have a utilitarian value of our family or, even for me, of nature or of a tree is because if you see yourself as part of nature, as part of your family, it's one and the same, then all of those sort of ideas of ownership, what is the value, what is the nature capital of this, they don't make sense anymore. Because if I am nature and we are interdependent on each other and we're all part of the web of life, then the way of looking after it and trying to restore it is a different way than what we used to, because it will just be, how would I look after myself? Or how would I, if I take an action here, how is it going to impact everything around me? And that's sort of where the deeper cultural understanding and shift needs to change. And going back to once you agree in that, and actually we've had amazing conversations with lots of organizations like CPRE, who recently said, we are nature. And when you get into a room and you realize actually there's a lot of people in this room who understand this, who get this, then you realize, hold on, we can keep making these links, and the culture is shifting and the culture is changing. And by changing the culture, we change the way we can restore and look after nature. And that's sort of what the project is also really keen to bring out of us. It's kind of bringing our whole selves into this academic space, and also allowing people from all different areas. Like I said, we've had policy people, we've had academics, we've had people who work closely with the land, we've had shamans at our workshops. To bring all these people in the same room is really the key to creating this community that will hopefully shift the culture to a nature-centric one.
So there are a couple of really interesting things in there, one of which I think rings true in relation to museums and collections, in that I'm a sort of jack of all trades and a master of none, desperately trying to get my head around caring for and curating 30,000 objects in a big shed, lots of which I have little or no direct connection to, or indeed sort of expert understanding of. So there's that challenge, a little bit like trying to represent nature on the board when you're representing, I think you said 10 million species, and that vast complexity. How can you be that voice? But also there's a way in which, even if we talk openly and inclusively about the way in which museums work, or understand the complexity or their boundedness in lots of problematic structural systems, whether that's post-colonial sort of questions about colonial legacies or about the Enlightenment and the framing of the world that gave us, we always retreat back to the systems that are in place to manage museums. So we place a value on collections, but then we pretend that they don't have a value. Curators aren't supposed to talk about the value of things because that's sort of ethically challenging and problematic. So there are always these kind of tensions in our own practice. And I think that's what I'm really interested in relation to this idea that you're bringing people together to sort of be part of a community of practice where they're sharing their whole selves and they're opening up and they're much more open to ideas that incorporate nature or are sympathetic to it or are allowing it to have a voice and a space. But how do you then, when they go back to their individual silos of practice, whether in a professional context or an academic context, how do you ensure that they take that sense of community practice and sense of connection to nature back into those spaces? Is this reliant on individuals? And I think this comes to a really critical question, which ties to one of your books, Tom, which is the self-delusion, this sense that maybe we aren't quite as individual as we think we are. Could you pick up on any of that kind of complexity?
I mean, I think, there's, as part of these meetings, everyone is coming, as Marzia said, with actually a kind of intuitive understanding that, we are part of nature. And in a sense, we're kind of just permitting people to reflect that deep value that they care about nature, which often, ironically, in some environmental jobs, you have to suppress because you have to talk about nature as a capital or an asset, et cetera, as we've talked about. So actually allowing people to reflect on that is important. I mean, the book you mentioned, The Self-Delusion, is about the science of our connection to each other and the natural world. The idea that, there's 38 trillion bacterial cells in our body, as well as the similar number of human cells. And those bacteria affect our moods and our behaviors. So we have less sort of independence from other species than we might think, And our DNA that builds our bodies is simply borrowed from our ancestors and pass it on to ancestors to come. And actually, biologists like Lynn Margulis point out that genes travel horizontally across the web of life as well, not just vertically. And actually, we're more like one big life form on this planet. That was her view, which sounds quite radical, but actually scientifically is it maybe a more accurate way of seeing life on the planet. So the science is clear. I mean, we are part of nature. But as you say, when we go back to our institutions, there's a certain way of doing things and talking things that can feel like, difficult to shift. And one thing we do in our workshop is we think carefully about the strategy, because it's very easy to see these ideas that we've talked about and say, oh, here's a bunch of hippies. The reality is you have to talk about the business of biodiversity. You have to wear a suit and go to finance meetings. But we know actually now that this can be problematic in terms of its ability to really protect nature. And we're not saying, let's just, fluffy think about the value of all life as infinite. We're saying, actually, when you make that fundamental pivot, there are concrete things you can do in terms of different ways of governing. So Marzia's talked about giving rights to nature and thinking about our responsibilities, putting nature on the board, different ways of actually completely structuring our financial systems where nature, maybe land owns itself, kind of quite sort of radical sounding ideas. But essentially, these are out there, but they only enter what's called the Overton window. They are, the window of what's politically possible when we have those worldview shifts, which is why our project is called Catalyst for Nature-centric Awareness and Governance. So partly it's about how to shift that awareness. And one thing we do is we think about the framing that these people working in different environment agencies, whether it's, DEFRA or JNCC or Natural England, when they have to go back to their day job, as you mentioned, how do they make that argument? And one argument is that everyone's concerned about the risks, the polycrisis, essentially. We know the way that humans are managing the planet is not sustainable in terms of climate change, biodiversity loss, ocean acidification, air pollution, you name it. Each of these challenges creating social crises like food insecurity, mass human migration, civil unrest, geopolitical disruptions over, water shortages, resource shortages. It's a very gloomy situation, but that framing and thinking about what we're doing about it at the moment and where are the limits of those solutions. And really what we're seeing is our solutions that are focused just on economic levers or just on technological levers. Although they have some merit, they're not sufficient. And a lot of science policy agencies now talk about this need for a deeper cultural shift. So these are big, international bodies, governments ratify these reports, and these reports say that unless we have a shift towards this essentially a nature-centric worldview, seeing ourselves as part of nature, we won't shift the dial on these problems. So we're giving, these workshops, we're hopefully providing a framing for these people to be able to land this science of who we are in relation to nature, but also the different alternative techniques with a bit more credibility.
So essentially, Tom, instead of learning to play the game better, we're trying to change the game, and that's what it's all about. So I think that's a nice leading in point to the wider process of those workshops, which actually had other creative stuff going on and different approaches to sort of changing the way we think about these challenging issues. Marzia?
I just want to follow on what Tom was saying about the risks how that's an important framing. So I think the workshops are very much risk assessing our environmental pathways and solutions, and by giving a voice to nature. And we had in another workshop, future generations represented. So we had nature represented in those workshops. It allows us to look at these risks that Tom was referring to from a different perspective. And by having those represented in our workshops, it actually, there's research that shows that your thinking is more long-term than you would when you're looking at the risks that surround us today, So that's, and that workshop is all about the head, we're using our minds, we're getting our minds together in a room. But the second part of the workshop is where we start to listen and talk with our hearts. And this is where the coffee houses come in. So the coffee houses were, they used to be in the 17th century, and there used to be coffee shops in London where anyone could go and listen to talks about anything that was happening on the day. I think Newton went to deliver talks, and they were called penny universities because for a penny you could buy a coffee and you could listen and learn. And at the university, we thought it would be good to be able to bring people together in this relaxed way and have these coffee houses. And we ask people to bring something that connects them to nature, whether it's a poem or music or an object. And we've had people bring the most amazing stories, nature connection stories to the evening event, to the coffee house. And then that way, when they combine, so back to your question, is when you go back into your day job, how do you carry on that message that you've learned? Okay, I felt this connection to nature. I've heard about these nature-centric approaches. Now what? The idea is that those two combined, the head and the heart, has an ability to carry with you for longer, and it kind of reminds you that you do have deeper values, and it's okay to bring those deeper values into your work environment. And actually, it's just a more authentic way of doing your job. And that's and we've shown that even in a professional context, you can combine the two.
And am I right that you do meditation as part of this?
Yeah, so the idea is that the workshop in the day is quite, cognitively demanding. We're talking about a lot of technical things about, different ways of governing, etc. Then we're going to have this evening event, and we bring along, we invite further people who are like local artists or poets or musicians, etc. And so in between the two, it's important to have a bit of downtime so that, we're kind of allowing people to, for their thinking to settle down a bit and to really show up with their whole person. So as part of that, as the first event, we did a silent walk up a nature reserve, and we had a meditation, what we call a nature-centric meditation as part of that. And at the top, we had a bit of a talk about the local geology and the ecology. The second workshop was in a city in Reading. So actually we couldn't go to a nature reserve nearby, but we did a sound meditation. So someone plays these big gongs. And when I actually arrived a little bit late, and it was quite interesting to see all these people, it was a workshop about the built environment. So how we think about our cities and can we be more nature-centric in how we build? And to see all these people who are sort of professional developers and regulators lying under blankets listening to this sound meditation. But afterwards, everyone was super relaxed and really... It just allows you to kind of recenter and kind of then come at the evening event and really talk about your deeper values.
I have to admit, I didn't participate in any of the cognitive hard thinking in either of those workshops, but I was here at work all day, and then afterwards got to go along and experience that silent walk and the gong bathing workshop and participate in the evening coffee house events. So it works for sort of clearing your head of the complexities of managing heritage as much as thinking about the deep concerning issues of the polycrisis. But the meditation that was part of, I think, that silent walk, sort of incorporated into it, that you both ran, was just extraordinarily powerful.
Well, seeing as we've just been talking about lots of complex ideas to do with the environment and domination and all these policies, shall we do the meditation now?
Yes.
Let's get Marzia to give us a meditation.
So perhaps you're in your kitchen listening to this podcast, or you're out on a walk. And as humans, we sometimes live in autopilot, just floating from one task to another with our busy minds. And they serve their purpose, but now it's time to access our rest and digest systems. So I want you to breathe in. And as you breathe out with a big sigh. And when you breathe in again, think of the particles that are filling your lungs, the breath of other beings, the oxygen gifted to us by the trees and the plants. And as we breathe out, imagine the warm air leaving your organs. And this is the breath that the plants breathe in. And when you breathe in again, what can you smell? Can you smell some food that nature provided us? Can you smell the earth? Let's observe nature around us. Perhaps it's the air, the light, the feeling on your skin. And can you hear nature? We can accept that there's human life intertwined with the sounds of nature. But if you close your eyes, can you hear some nature somewhere? And so we've cleared our minds and we've opened our hearts to this moment, and everything has fallen away, our tasks, our jobs, our roles. And we're made up of bacteria, molecules, and cells, the same matter as millions of other beings. And as we quiet the mind, we feel the connection to nature, and there's a sense of peace and belonging. Some call this connection shared consciousness. Perhaps it's an energy. And if we zoom out, we see ourselves as part of the web of life, part of nature, interwoven and unburdened by the stuff that separates us from nature and from the truth that we are nature. We realize we are living, and this massive life that we are part of provides us with a connection. And this connection is vast, it's spacious, it's calming. And we thank ourselves for making the time to pause. And now we listen differently, not with our ears, but with our hearts. And at this very moment, millions of beings are pausing and connecting to the web of life, relying on each other to share the wisdom. We can hear this wisdom. What does it say? A river flowing with a strong current could say, all will pass. An orange sunset at the end of the day saying, the day is over. It's time to let go. And a plant growing really slowly is saying, be patient, all will be achieved. And when we listen to nature, we connect. We connect with each other, we connect with energies, the universe, stars, trees, water. And together, our collective conscious holds the key. The deep understanding, the wisdom that we are not separate. We are connected to our past, our ancestors, and our future generations. And this wisdom guides us to our action. So dissolve your being into the water. Dissolve your being into the tree. Dissolve your being into the wind. Dissolve your being into the breath. And access the wisdom of nature. I want you to carry this moment with you and remember it can be accessed anytime with one breath. Then tune your senses into nature. Connect to the collective unconscious, and you'll find the wisdom and knowledge.
Is Ollie asleep?
Not quite. Almost. I did fell asleep in the wood, I'm pretty sure, when we did it in the wood.
That was amazing. Nice. Thanks so much.
Yeah. Welcome.
Well, I think that's a lovely way to end this first episode. So thank you so much, Tom and Marzia. And we'll be back with you next time.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And thanks for listening. Thank you for listening to Absolute Units. I've been Joe Vaughan, and my co-host has been Dr. Ollie Douglas. Absolute Units is made possible through Museums Partnership Reading, our Arts Council funded partnership of the Merle and Reading Museum. We'll be back with Tom and Marzia again in 2 weeks' time, picking up where we left off. See you then.